And this is exactly what happened with one of these companies that spent over $300 million. They designed studies with nearly 600 patients, and they figured out that they were probably 5 patients away from showing that statistical difference.
So, placebo. And more, there's this whole field of science around placebo effect, right? Walk us through kind of how you look at, or the market looks at, placebo effect as a function of seeing statistical significance. And what is statistical significance? How do you think about placebo? Maybe it's philosophical and scientifically. And then how do we think about when we're making an experiment? Does it seem to appear that it's working, or do we actually know that it's working? And which sounds like a weird thing to say, but the appearances in many cases, especially over a period of time and as populations expand, when you're trying these trials, really shifts, and what you thought was happening really wasn't happening.
Right. So the traditional way placebo is looked at, a standard trial is I have a group of patients, we call them group A, they get the treatment, whatever the treatment you've defined as the treatment. The other group, which is your control group. So again, clinical trials are just really high stakes experiments. And so in this case, you have a hypothesis, which is your endpoint that you're trying to prove. And you say, hey, I'm going to have a treatment group, group A, they're going to get the treatment. Group B is going to get control or placebo. So in some cases, it's not placebo. It's actually the thing that you're going up against, which is standard of care. What is standardly done to treat these patients? Because you can't sometimes give them placebo. You can't withhold treatment for someone. So I used to think placebo was this placebo effect, like you're just looking for the effect of people thinking they're being treated. But the reality is, you know, this is a disease. It does things, it has sort of a mind of its own. You want to track the progression of that disease. So that's what the control group is there for, is to determine what happens during the period of your trial, because your trial could be a year, 2 years, even longer. And you want to know what is happening to the natural course of that disease, because some people could naturally be healed. And you don't want to bias your treatment group as people being healed because they're just naturally being healed. So it is not just about the people and the bias that's associated with the people involved in the study, but the actual progression of the disease. So you're trying to control for that. And so the typical process is you have to get agreement with the FDA as to what is considered success. So let's say in one scenario, it's pretty easy. 90% of the patients in your treatment group all responded to the endpoint that you determined with the FDA. Only 10% did in the control or placebo group. Pretty big difference. Probably any statistical measure you would use, you could probably say that that is a meaningful difference, that the people that were treated actually had a benefit versus the people that were untreated. What if that number is 50 and 30? How do you determine whether that is meaningful or not? And that is typically done by a statistical measure that you have to determine in advance with the FDA. So as an example, in some of the trials, you will say that, hey, I need 95% confidence that you are within a certain difference between the active and placebo. And that usually means you're 2 standard deviations at least away from the 2 treatment groups. So 50 to 30, if you have a huge standard error and if they overlap, likely there's no statistical difference there. And this is exactly what happened with one of these companies that spent over $300 million. They designed studies with nearly 600 patients, and they figured out that they were probably 5 patients away from showing that statistical difference. But because the placebo group had a larger effect than they anticipated, because the patients themselves were naturally resolving, they expected no more than 10% of patients to naturally resolve from their disease, and they got something on the order of 15%. And as a result, there weren't enough patients to show statistical power, and they had to redo all their studies. And this is why it's incredibly important that the expectation and assumptions you make about what you expect in the trial or the experiment are meaningful, and that there's room for error so that you can still meet the endpoint.